As a new power is rising in the East, challenging the United States in a way the Soviet Union could only dream of, something weird is happening to America's biggest and most powerful technology companies, companies that are crucial to American national security and defense. A foreign country, or more specifically, a foreign intelligence agency, has managed to infiltrate these companies en masse. One of the reasons we know this is due to the incredible work of Murtaza Hussain. Murtaza is a journalist who's been reporting on how national security and technology intersect since the day he was reporting on and uncovering Edward Snowden files. Murtaza has written two interesting articles in these regards. The first is on how 1,400 ex-members of the Israel's Signal Intelligence Agency, Unit 8200, are actively working in American big tech companies. And the second is on how Google just spent $32 billion buying an Israeli company that is co-founded and led by people who worked for the same Israeli intelligence agency, Unit 8200. Today, I wanted to ask Murtaza what exactly is going on, what level of infiltration is happening, how did this happen in the first place, and what the implications are on American national security and defense. Murtaza, thank you for joining us today, and I wanted to start there. What exactly is going on?
Well, okay, let me frame it this way. Let's take this, the US national security apparatus, one of its primary tools is to prevent foreign influence and foreign control of critical industries in the United States. Industries which are related to U.S. infrastructure, security sector, and so forth. Because uh, even if a country is friendly to the United States today, it's well known that politics changes over time and the relationships change. And if a country has influenced a certain sector and things start to go sideways, they could use that influence to exert pressure on the United States or even harm the United States by using the privileged information and data and access that they have. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is industrial espionage, stealing things which are, the things which are the beneficial trade secrets of the United States and sharing them with another country, transmitting them, stealing them. That's also another concern. And if any country had a very large number of former intelligence agents working in an American industry, at all levels of it, that would be a concern. That would be a national security concern. If England had a lot of intelligence agents working for U.S. big tech firms, that would be alarming. If Japan did, let alone a country that does not have a formal alliance with the United States, in this case, Israel. So, in we have done a story, as you mentioned, recently that showed that there are about 1,400 more, at least 1,400, publicly identified 1,400 members of Israel's Signals Intelligence Unit, Unit A200, working in big tech firms at all different levels. It's a profoundly high number of people to work in any industry from a foreign intelligence agency. Now, I will add the caveat that just because someone's working in a US big tech firm, they have intelligence background in Israel, it doesn't mean that they're spying. That's not the reason that they're necessarily doing it. But as people who know about this world know, you're never necessarily a former. The word former is kind of very attenuated, and the line between the public and private sector in Israel, especially, is quite blurry. So it opens a risk. It actually opens a risk that someone could engage in espionage or be even subject to pressure to engage in espionage by their home country or the country they did their intelligence and military service in. That could be the detriment of the United States and for the benefit of Israel. So you have this profound concentration of people, intelligence agents working in Israel, sorry, working in the US tech sector from Israel. What has practically happened as a result of that, and what could happen? Well, what could happen is obviously they could build backdoors into all the programs they're building, the networks they're developing. They're very into cybersecurity and things like that. They could, do things to siphon data in certain directions, especially when Israel is perceived to be in danger. They could do things to share data that's privileged American data with Israel out of a moral compulsion that they feel for their country and things like that. So that's, obviously a threat. But, what's also happening, and we can see this, and I've written about this as well too, is that you have this sort of like entryism into, this sector of the American economy. And what I mean by that is that you have certain people who have intelligence backgrounds in this foreign country. They've risen to be prominent in certain tech firms in the United States. And what they've done with their new positions is that they've basically engaged in buyouts of more Israeli intelligence officials who've created startups after they finished their intelligence service in Israel. That's a very common thing in Israel. Like the intelligence sector and military are seen as incubators for private sector firms after people leave their service. So what they're doing is, they're going in there, and I've put a whole list of these in an article. But they're going in and they're buying out their former colleagues in their units, and that they graduate from the same units, but making those people millionaires. And then when they make them millionaires, they also bring them into American tech companies. They bring them into Google. They bring them into Palo Alto Networks, all these different companies, and they further entrench that same concentration of foreign intelligence officers in American industry that I was talking about. Because the more buyouts you do, you increase the degree to which the U.S. Silicon Valley tech sector is effectively culturally and institutionally part of the Israeli security establishment. And that's why I think you've seen also this culture of Silicon Valley shift in the last decade and a half. It used to be kind of like a hippie kind of culture almost. It had like the origins in the US counterculture that existed in the 60s. Now it's become like a very neoconservative, very, that type of politics sector of American society, notably so, something almost like Wall Street, for instance. And that is because the personnel has changed through this sort of self-licking ice cream cone of buyouts and entryism and the symbiotic relationships developed between the Silicon Valley and specific units of Israel's signals
Mm,
intelligence apparatus.
mm. Wow, that's actually a pretty radical change in terms of the culture of big tech and Silicon Valley. I wanted to ask regarding your numbers a little bit. Help me understand this. So it was 1,400 ex-members that currently work there. How do we know this? What's the methodology here? Did we go through LinkedIn profiles? And then is this a conservative estimate?
It's a database which is compiled by a researcher who scraped from LinkedIn people's publicly identified affiliations with UNA 200, but also, it's not just LinkedIn, it's people who have talked about it. Like anyone who's publicly mentioned their service in UNA 200, either in US or Israel, a lot of them at least are in this database. But it's a conservative number. It's a conservative number because a lot of people don't, for reasons you can understand, they probably wouldn't put that they served in a foreign intelligence agency on their LinkedIn or other social media profile because they don't want to seem suspicious. But I guess the issue is that it was not stigmatized. It was basically an open secret, and so people didn't feel any need to do that. Maybe that'll change now because some people are scrutinizing it a little bit. But I think they don't care actually. They're willing to continue to do this in a way, and yeah, that's how it came about.
And then how high up does this go? Are we talking about like low level staff cooperating with each other? Are we talking about high level staff cooperating? C suite. What's the nature of the relationship between Israel's intelligence agency and American tech companies?
Well, yeah, look, there's one thing that came to light recently, which is that Microsoft CEO was meeting the head of Unit A200 to help build services to help for them to conduct mass surveillance on Palestinian civilians in the West Bank. So, it's just these personal relationships which have been created. How did you even get a connection to the head of Unit A200 in this personal way? Well, obviously, I guess they can reach out to one another, but how did Unit A200 get access to him is actually the better question. It's these symbiotic relationships, and people are cooperating with each other. They're cooperating on a very, almost a systematic scale, and a lot of money is changing hands. They're making these arrangements happen, and that deal only eventually was canceled and basically put in abeyance, at least as a result of mass public outcry over the genocide, including internally in Microsoft. So, one can imagine for everything we do know that's reported, there's a lot we don't know. We're only reporting what we find out and what whistleblowers or leaks make available for public knowledge. There's a lot more that happens, I'm sure, that going on, not just Microsoft, other companies, Google, Amazon, smaller tech firms in Silicon Valley. It's happening everywhere, and it's becoming more rather than less. And the main issue, I would say, that I find that it's a problem is that the US government is not interested in combating this issue or regulating it. They seem to be actually exacerbating it. And Israel has been a major source of industrial espionage in the United States for, the FBI said it was the number one source for many, many years.
Can I ask
And
on that? Sorry, like, are there like laws or regulatory bodies that are like being circumvented, or do they not exist, or what's going on there?
Well, it's funny because I think the biggest circumvention of law which is taking place generally, which affects everything, is the uh, exemption to the Foreign Agents Registration Act for pro-Israel organizations in the United States. That exemption has allowed like a gigantic spider web of organizations to emerge, which are not identifying themselves as being advocates for a foreign country, although they clearly are, and that disseminates throughout society effectively. So I think that if Israeli, if pro-Israel organizations have a right to lobby for Israel's interest in the United States, like other countries legally to do, but they have to register with FARA in that sense. If without doing that, then all the problems which people created FARA in the first place to solve, not just are created in the subject, but they become everywhere. They become ubiquitous. They get in the economy. They get in government. God knows all the different places that this impact is felt. So, that's kind of the like if I were to pick one overarching subject or way that this could be ameliorated or begun to be ameliorated, it would be changing this FAR exemption and loophole. And that's not the same issue with the Silicon Valley issue directly, but it's affected by it. It's definitely affected by it. And in the terms of a lack of FBI will and effort in investigating, preventing this sort of bad business practices or espionage and spying, I think it's a political decision. People have not allocated resources to this. And they haven't allocated resources because the penetration of Israeli influence in American institutions has become pervasive. And, like I said, they have a right to lobby for their interests, but Americans also have a right to defend their sovereignty, and that's not being done.
Murtaza, something I'm curious about is the role of the ownership of these companies, because some of these companies are owned by American billionaires that are openly pro-Zionist or pro-Israel, or openly supportive of Israel. Because like on the one hand, I'm talking about the Larry Elsons, I'm talking about the Dave Karps, I'm talking about the Bill Ackmans of the world. Because on the one hand, you literally have staff that came from Israel's intelligence agency, and on the other, you have highly motivated billionaires and leadership of these actual companies.
Okay, let me just give you one very prominent, important example right now. That David Ellison, who I mentioned earlier, CEO of Oracle, him and his son are basically Larry Ellison and his son David Ellison are basically buying out the American media. They're doing an authoritarian level consolidation of American media outlets. They bought CBS and they put Barry Weiss in charge. Barry Weiss is obviously a professional pro-Israel activist, lifelong pro-Israel activist. They put her in charge of CBS, so she's going to run one of the biggest news organizations in America, trying to buy all these other companies, like basically CNN will be under their control. Warner Brothers, like a huge train of organizations, will be controlled by these people, the Ellison family. And what are their motivations? Well, Larry Ellison is the largest single individual donor to the Friends of the IDF. And Dropsite, the story that myself and my colleague Ryan Grimm reported in 2015, he was vetting presidential candidates for the election in the U.S., specifically whether on the question of whether they're good for Israel, and he was working with Israeli government officials to do that. So one can only imagine what his interests are now in buying out the media. And he's not just happy with buying out the media institutions who make the news and produce television shows and all these other things. He's trying to buy TikTok. He's part of the consortium to buy TikTok. And Oracle, as we know, is going to audit the TikTok algorithm going forward in the United States. So they're going to control what young users of TikTok use. TikTok's users do skew majority young. So they're trying to, this is like third world country level, one guy owns all the media, him and his son. That's like not a democratic sort of norm. That's more like a completely corrupt, backwards, authoritarian country would have things like that happening. And it's happening now. And basically, this Israel subject is becoming the vehicle to entrench authoritarianism in the United States. And these billionaires, they're basically the oligarchs of the United States. They've settled around who someone they see as a strong man they can work with, they can dispense favors to them, this case, the president, and they're working to create a new status quo where they control everything people see. As I said, I'm not confident it's going to work, but they're really giving it a shot. They're trying to buy out our media and flood it with pro-Israel propaganda, and I think that that actually makes the counter narrative and the truth about the subject even more important to try to seek out and broadcast. to undercut this, in my view, very ham-handed attempt to propagandize Americans and you.
And finally, as we're running out of time, I wanted to ask what you think the future of these tools, especially with the rise of AI.
So, I would say that now we're entering the era. I'll tell you something, an example. When I was working on the Edward Snowden documents, maybe more than a decade and a half ago now, 2013 it must have been now. Uh, we went through a tremendous amount of data. There was tremendous data in there collected by, I guess, the U.S. government doing surveillance around the world, etc. I think that was reassuring about that, ironically, was that there was just so much data and nobody could ever possibly process all of this, read all this, whatever. It just wouldn't be worth it, and it's not really. It would take a lot of time and money. It's very impractical. Now, with the advent of artificial intelligence platforms, you can actually do mass surveillance. You can get every data and process every bit of data and have the AI process it for you and give you conclusions and find things for you and stuff like that. So one can imagine that as this technology is progressing, as we see these documented relationships between Israel and other countries in the region to build ties against and without a settlement for the Palestinians in the face of mass opposition from public. It's a way that they can help these people stay in power by surveilling their populations. And surveillance is very important for repression. It's basically the prerequisite for repression. So that's kind of how I imagine this evolving. And I would say that, given the way that not just Israeli spy tech, but also Chinese spy tech is disseminating around the world, I think popular uprisings and revolutions, they may become almost impossible at least in the forthcoming technological environment because they will afford authoritarian countries that don't have the rule of law, and even the US rule of law is weakening. They would allow them an unbelievable level of insight and control in their populations, such that anyone who even tried to organize against them would be seen and caught far before their efforts could make traction.
All right, thank you very much for your time, Murtaza. If you guys haven't read Murtaza's articles, I'd encourage you to read it. I'd also encourage you to read two of Murtaza's Epstein article to see the level of penetration between US elites and Israeli elites and how tech is used, specifically this example, which is very detailed about Mongolia. And you can make your own extrapolations about how this could be applied elsewhere. And please do subscribe because I don't know the details because I'm not privy to it, unfortunately. I do know Murtaza and co at Dropsite News are working on some very revealing and important stories about this in the near future. So yeah, please do subscribe. Thank you, Murtaza, for your time.
Thanks for having me. Glad to talk to you.